We also use retrospective facial recognition through the Home Office provision of the Police National Database at the moment, although in the Met we are actually procuring our own system. Nationally, there's a third use of facial recognition, which I think is probably worth mentioning at this point, and that's what we call officer-initiated facial recognition. And that's somewhere between retrospective, which is the historical use, and live, and it's where an officer in the street has access to a mobile phone, and they'll take a picture of the suspect, and it will immediately then compare that picture to a watch list of images.
In each of these cases, is it right to say that there's a common denominator, which is a watch list? In other words, you've got a list of not just people, but their faces, images of them, that it's checking against. So it's not an abstract picture derived by artificial intelligence of, as it were, someone likely to commit crime. It's a specific individual that is uploaded that it's looking for. Is that
Absolutely
correct?
Right. In all those three use cases, it's comparison against a watch list.
Right. And could you tell me how that watch list is compiled?
I'm going to take live facial recognition because it is actually different between those three different techniques I just described to you. So in live facial recognition, the watch list is bespoke and specific to the deployment, and it's generated by looking at the intelligence case. So essentially the reason why we're using the technology in the first place. The watch list is then compiled based on crime types, based on people likely to be in the area at that time who are wanted, whether wanted for serious offences, wanted on court warrants. And then after that deployment is complete, that watch list is deleted. So it's very much a bespoke watch list for the deployment location at that point in time. For example, if you take the coronation, it was specific and bespoke to that event and contained some fixated individuals who we knew were going to go to the coronation and potentially do harm.
I see. And just in terms of the artificial intelligence
Yes.
dimension of this, first of all, in terms of the technology, did you design it yourself? Did you write it yourself, or is it procured?
No, absolutely not. It's procured. I'll speak openly. It's from NEC. That information is publicly available on our website. NEC manufacture all different types of facial recognition technology, and that's the algorithm that we're using.
Okay, and just say a little about what is the artificial intelligence in this?
The facial recognition technology involves essentially biometric matching, and Dr. Mansfield will be able to explain the AI in probably much better detail than I can. But the AI element of that is where the algorithm is doing that biometric matching. So essentially, it's looking at the watch list, looking at each image, and taking a set of measurements of the face. That's the biometric bit, and it's comparing it to the measurements of the face of the image that the cameras then pick up.
Does it differ in any material respect from the e-passport gates, where you put your passport in and the camera recognises whether you are the person on the passport?
It's not NEC technology, I don't think, at e-passport gates, and I don't know enough about what they're using to be able to answer that. Behind it is facial recognition technology.
Just briefly, Dr. Mansfield, because we'll come into more detail on it, but are we talking about the same sort of thing, even though they might be manufactured by different people?
The e-gates, the face recognition, is the same sort of thing. It's manufactured by different companies and developed by different companies. And the AI component is... The AI techniques are used in order to extract the best features for making face comparisons, and that's left to artificial intelligence to develop that, rather than being kind of a predefined model of
I see. So it's a step beyond the e-gates thing that is looking for fixed parameters. It's more exploratory as to what might be.
Both the e-gate system and the NEC systems are probably have a fair amount of neural networks, artificial intelligence in their development processes.
They do too. So actually some of what we're talking about in the police context actually might have an application for border security, in particular passport control as well.
Absolutely, potentially yes. And the other thing I should say about the live facial recognition algorithms we used is it's a closed network. So by that I mean there's computers in a van, to put this really simplistically, and there's cameras on the van, and that loop is closed. So it's not linked up to other cameras, and neither is it retaining the information and learning from every face that goes in front of it. That's not happening.
Okay, so just specifically on that before I turn to my colleague. So it's not that sort of every CCTV camera across London is, as it were, sort of primed to look for a person on the watch list.
Absolutely
You've set up
not.
a camera in a place that you suspect that the person might be frequenting, and it's that camera and that camera alone, rather than, as it were, sort of remote ones being accessed.
Absolutely. It's limited to the cameras which are specific to that deployment based on a specific intelligence case which is relevant to the area we're in. So, for example, we deployed it recently in Camden. In Camden, we know there'd been significant amounts of gang crime and knife-enabled robbery. And there was also, you'll recall earlier in January, the shooting around Euston, again, gang-affiliated. That seemed to be a good location. There was a strong intelligence case, so we set up cameras in a closed loop back to the van with a specific watch list for that deployment.
I see. So that's how it's done at the moment. But in principle, could the network of cameras across the country, across the capital, be linked to that watch list so that they could not be a closed loop in the way that you describe it, but it could be a general thing? Is it an operational or a policy decision you've made to restrict it, or is it a different? Is it technically impossible to do the broader thing?
So technically, I think it probably is possible. But we're governed by the law, and currently we're operating under the common law primarily, and then a patchwork of other legislation underneath it, and various codes of practice and other information from regulators and advice that we're following as well. So under that, and learning an awful lot from the Bridges judgment and the Bridges appeal, at the moment, there must be a solid use case for why we're deploying the technology. We need to understand the questions brought up in Bridges, which is around where are you deploying it and why, and what's the proportionality and necessity of that, and who is on the watch list, and again, why, and the proportionality and necessity of that.
I think my colleagues were going into some detail on that case. The subject of our inquiry, the purpose of our inquiry, is the future governance of AI. So these questions of what might be possible are equally as of interest as what is currently being done. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn to my colleagues now, starting with Dawn Butler and then Graham Stringer.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for coming in today. Ms Chiswick, just want to pick up on some of the responses to the Chair just now. In regards to the data that you collect, you said it's a closed loop. So Big Brother Watch has been doing a lot of work around this. So can we confirm that all of the data that you collect, say, at the coronation of live facial recognition, that all of that data has been deleted?
We don't collect data, actually, on a live facial recognition deployment. If you imagine you're in the crowd and you walk past the camera instantaneously will compare the faces it sees to the watch list. It's literally instantaneous. If you're not on that watch list, not only is your facial image immediately and forever deleted, but also it's pixelated. And this is what we call a privacy by design function, which means if you're an officer sitting in the van looking at that succession of people coming past the cameras, you can't even see the individual faces. They're all pixelated.
Okay.
The only exception to that is if we get a hit, a positive match, in which case the match can be retained for 31 days or longer if it's needed for judicial purposes.
Okay, so in regards to if you get a match,
Yes.
Is it not correct that 81% of people flagged by live facial recognition were in fact innocent?
I don't recognise those figures. I know those figures keep popping up, and maybe it's something we can talk about when we come onto the National Physical Laboratory report and what we found out about the accuracy of the algorithm. But as an example, at the coronation, there were 2 positive matches, and that, to me, shows the precision of that technology. And they were both accurate.
But how many false matches were
0.
there? 'Cause so that is the issue, isn't it? Because in January 2022, the Met deployed LFR near Oxford Circus, and 1 person was triggered on the alert. They were subsequently stopped. They weren't the person, they were innocent. They provided ID to show they were not the person on the watch list, but then they were subjected to further scrutiny and biometric tests before they were allowed to let go. So does that not does that not imply that you're therefore assuming that people are guilty rather than innocent? Why did that person have to provide further information? Because the live facial recognition was incorrect.
So I don't, unfortunately, have details of that specific incident with me, but I'm very happy to provide further details on it later.
Does Dr. Mansfield, are you familiar with that particular incident?
I'm not familiar.
You're not,
with
okay,
it.
that's fine.
It's,
Does it worry you, though? Does it worry you that there's an over-reliance on a system that is 81% incorrect, so much so that if somebody is stopped and says, well, I'm not that person, you know, it's like, well, prove it to us again.
There's two ways I want to answer that. First of all, I can look back at the last 6 deployments we've done, and I can tell you of those 6 deployments, we have had 2, 3, 4 true alerts and 0 false alerts. I'll need to go back to your 2022 example, but that's as an example of just how precise the technology is. It's not flagging alerts all the time.
Isn't it how do you measure it? How, when you say 0 false alerts, it's only because you're only counting your positive alerts. So what does that mean? What does that mean exactly? I think...
We count true alerts and we count false alerts, and we test the system throughout a deployment by having what we call a blue list, which are our own members of staff and officers who are on a separate watch list who walk past through the system every, I think, 40 minutes or so to check that it's working accurately and it's not simply just not detecting anybody. The other thing, I said I answered in 2 ways. That the second answer to what you're saying is what happens when an alert happens? What does the officer do? So the facial recognition of technology only takes you so far. It takes you to the point of a potential identification. That's all. And it will show the watch list picture, and it will show the picture of the individual who's a potential identification on the mobile phone device that the officer carries.
Of the police officer?
Yeah, to the police officer. And they'll look at that, and that's when their normal officer powers kick in, and they'll look at it and they'll think, is that a match? Is that a likely match? If they don't think it's a match, they don't need to do anything. They're not compelled to make the stop.
But that's on paper.
If they think it's a match, there's no immediate arrest. They'll go and talk to that person and have an engagement. That's similar to any day-to-day activity of a police officer who acts usually on suspicion. At this point, they're having a tool, a very accurate tool, to point them in the right direction. So then all the other activity you saw subsequent to that is standard officer engagement.
So standard officer engagement in regards, for instance, to stop and search is disproportionately discriminated against young black men. And in all cases, and the Met being one of the highest, 80% of the times nothing's found. So if you're building a system based on a already discriminatory system, then you're making that discrimination worse. Can I ask you another question? Do we have a demographic breakdown of the watch list that the Met currently hold?
So no, we don't, and that's because we don't go after individuals on the watch list. We don't say, let's take that named person and put them on the watch list. The watch list is made up of crime types. So the demographic balance of that is not something that's considered. It's the crime types, it's the wanted people in the area at the time, and immediately afterwards, as I was saying, that watch list is deleted.
Can we get a demographic breakdown of the watch list?
We haven't done that because there's no policing purpose to retain and then process that information for that reason.
If you have a watch list that's 90% women, it would mean that you're looking for women in a crowd, because that's on your... If a woman flags up, you'd be like, oh, right, okay, that woman is the person that's on our watch list. There's more of a match there. So there is a correlation between the demographic breakdown of the watch list and what you do with that information. So is it possible to get a breakdown?
So first of all, we'd never put a watch list together which was 90% any demographic differential.
But if you don't measure it, how do you know?
It's not how it's done. It's based on crime types, people who are wanted for robbery offences in the area, people who are wanted on court warrants. And there's a breakdown and a list of the types of offences, the types of reasons to be included in the watch list on our policy. So that's available and open to the public. So we wouldn't go after a specific demographic. That wouldn't be right, would
Can you
it?
provide the committee with a breakdown?
So I can't, because we delete the watch list within 24 hours immediately after the deployment, and there isn't a policing purpose to process the data in that way. Technically,
You say you delete the watch list.
yes.
So you haven't got a watch list. The Met hasn't got a watch list.
So the watch list is bespoke to the individual deployment. So each live facial recognition deployment we do, we create a very bespoke watch list of crime types which mirror the reason for being in that area in the first place. We then, at the end of the deployment, delete that watch list, which was bespoke to the deployment. And then if we were going to deploy again somewhere else for a different reason, we'd create a different watch list of different crime types.
So there's no way at any time of getting a breakdown.
So
And you only have a watch list, a temporary watch list. There's never a permanent watch list.
It's not a permanent watch list for live facial recognition technology. For every deployment, it's based on an individual intelligence case, which is the reason why it's both proportionate and necessary for us to be in that area operating at the time. That watch list is then bespoke to the deployment. We use it and then we delete it because there's no lawful reason for us to retain that data. Technically, we could do it, keep the watch list, but lawfully we can't. We delete it each time because there's no policing reason to process data purely to find out demographic difference within a watch list.
Do you see any risks at all with live facial recognition or other facial recognitions or AI and its deployment in the Met?
I completely understand public concern around live facial recognition technology and AI, and there's lots of debate going on around that at the moment. What I've tried to do with the introduction of facial recognition technology in the Met is do so in a careful, proportionate and as transparent as we possibly can be way. So we've published an awful lot of information online about how we operate, about exactly some of the things we were just talking about the distinctions of who can and can't be on a watch list, and all of the safeguards we've put in place in order to protect people.
What risks have you identified?
Gosh, I think we can run through the risks and the safeguards we've put in place at every single stage of the operation. So starting right at the beginning, I talked about necessity and proportionality of why we're going there in the first place. This isn't a fishing expedition. We're targeting areas where there's public concern about high levels of crime, whether that's thefts and knife-enabled thefts on Oxford Street, where they operated before, or whether it was some of the gang-related violence and also knife-enabled robbery going on in Camden. So there's some examples of specific use cases. Carrying that through from why we're there in the first place, there's then the proportionality of the watch list, following our policy as to who goes on there and why. And then on the day of deployment, we have safeguards in place there. So we won't run the deployment if there's something wrong with the technology. The images that are accepted into watch lists need to be of a certain quality. The cameras need to be operating in a certain way to make sure they're also as accurate as we can make them. Throughout the deployment, there's special training given to officers who are going to deploy on the ground, which pulls out some of your concerns.
Sorry, just one last question. Does the training include further intrusion if somebody innocent has been identified? And my last question is, does it concern you in any way that the Metropolitan Police is currently institutionally racist, homophobic and misogynistic, and how that will affect the use of this technology?
Can I deal with institutional racism first, and then I'll come back to the further intrusion, because I'm not sure I fully understood that. You're referring to Baroness Casey's report and other incidents, and it's truly shocking what was in that report, and we have let the public and our own people down. I was shocked at some of the findings. I, at the same time, see it as an opportunity for reform. I think we must turn things around, and I hope the very careful way we've been approaching the deployment of live facial recognition technology is just that. So some of the work we've done with the National Physical Laboratory in order to really get to the heart of the bias in that technology and understand how we can use AI, but use it in a proportionate, fair and equal way has been hugely important to me. That's why we publish what we can online in order to be as transparent as we can. And then before we deploy, we do an awful lot of engagement. So we engage not only with commissioners, with civil society, with various groups, we also engage with different community groups and different demographic differentials across the piece to understand their feelings about the technology. And then before we actually go to a location to deploy, we do something called a community impact assessment, where we go out and talk to members of the community about how they feel about having live facial recognition deployed there.
Is it not the case that there was one person who, I think Big Brother Watch, held up a sign saying the police are operating live facial recognition, they avoided where the police were, and then they got a £90 fine because they covered their face? And that was then assumed that they had something to hide, whereas they just didn't want to be on a police camera, which we police by consent in this country. So if you don't want the police to take an image of your face, which is like a fingerprint, then we police by consent. That's your choice.
We do police by consent, and at any live facial recognition deployment, and those who want to are very welcome to come out and see one actually in operation. We put notices up to tell the public that live facial recognition is going on.
By the time they get to the notice, their faces have already been in the system, because by the time you get to the notice, the camera's already taken a facial picture of them. Sorry, Chair.
No, it's an important area, but Ms. Chiswick, just answer that, please.
So the placement of the signage is prior to getting onto the vision of the camera. The view of the camera is actually quite short. And again, if you want to come out and have a look, you can see the sort of zone of recognition and how far that goes along the road. We also, depending on the deployment and what we're seeking to do, publish on social media what we're going to be doing. So it is foreseeable to the public. We don't force people to walk through the cameras. I've been on the scene and many people have turned around and decided not to walk through the cameras. That's absolutely fine. But it is used as part of a wider policing operation usually. There will be police officers on the ground, and if they make an informed choice to stop an individual, that's a policing decision.
Okay, thank you. Let's take some more colleagues, starting with Graham Stringer and then Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Just a couple of questions to follow up, Lindsey. One, you said you made reassuring statements about the pixelation and removing, not retaining the images. Can you show that? Is it audited or checked by any external body?
So I can show it to anybody who wants to come and have a look at it. In terms of if you're thinking about who oversees us and how the oversight mechanisms work, again, it's quite a complex patchwork. Directly, we have MOPAC, Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, who have a seat at my strategic facial recognition board that I run within the Met. Stepping out a little bit more broadly from MOPAC, there's the Information Commissioner's Office, there's the Biometrics and Surveillance Camera Commissioner, and we've just started some engagement with the Equality and Human Rights Commission as well.
But does anybody go in and check what you're saying about the technology is accurate?
Yes, I mean that was the basis of our commission to the National Physical Laboratory to do the testing, and we requested the National Physical Laboratory to do testing to look at how accurate the technology was, and also to understand better levels of bias within the algorithm.
Come on to that in a second. Can you show operational benefits?
Absolutely. We've had a number of significant arrests as a result of facial recognition technology, including conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, assault on emergency workers, possession with intent to supply Class A drugs, grievous bodily harm, and being unlawfully at large, having escaped from prison. There's some of the examples that I've brought here today, but there's more benefit than just the number of arrests the technology alerts police officers to carry out. There's much wider benefit. The coronation is one example of where deterrence was a benefit. You'll have noticed we publicised quite widely in advance that we were going to be there as part of that deterrence effect. And then if I recall my time up in Camden, when I went to view one of the facial recognition deployments, there's a wider benefit to the community in that area at the time. And actually we got quite a lot of very positive reaction from shopkeepers and local people because of the impact it was having on crime in that area. And when we use facial recognition technology, usually it will be part of a much wider policing operation. So there'll be other stuff happening in the area as well, both some things you might see, some things you might not see.
I realise this is, the answer is difficult, but you arrest people all the time. Can you show an increase in arrests again and convictions against a baseline?
So I don't think an increase in arrests is really what this tool's about. This tool is a precision-based community crime-fighting tool. So if you imagine, I'm going to use a terrible analogy of the needle in the haystack, but the technology enables us to pick out a potential match of someone that's wanted, usually for very serious crimes, and have the opportunity to go and speak to that person. The results that I just read out to you are people who would still be at large if we hadn't used that technology. So it's not a tool for mass arrests. It's not a tool which is going to give you huge numbers of arrests. It's a tool that is very precisely going to focus on individuals that we're trying to identify.
I do understand that, and I realise that giving an accurate, detailed answer will be difficult, but it is arresting those wanted people and charging them, hopefully convicting them if they're guilty, against what otherwise would have happened. And I realise it's a difficult question to answer, but it's important that you can show that there is an improvement along those lines.
Insofar as those wanted individuals for pretty bad crimes are no longer on the streets, yes. We are doing more work to look at how else we might be able to evaluate the benefits of the technology. Bear in mind we're at the quite early stages still of what has been quite a sort of a careful journey.
Sorry, I'm repeating. So that's quantified, and you have those figures now.
I have figures in front of me about the number of arrests that have been made. It takes time for them to work through the judicial system, so arrests that have been made this year, which is what I have in front of me, won't yet have come through.
And you can give the committee that.
Again, in due course, yeah.
There are some figures there on arrests this year.
Yes, so we've deployed vans 6 times. We've done 3 deployments, Camden and Islington, and then there were 3 vans out during the coronation, so that's 3 different deployments. There were 4 true alerts. There were 0 false alerts throughout those 6 deployments, and there have been 2 arrests made, and the others were correct identifications, but it was decided arrest was not a necessary action in those circumstances.
Thank you. So, Dr. Mansfield, there's concern and worry about bias in the learning of AI built into the system. Could you reassure the committee or not that there isn't bias in the system that the Metropolitan Police are using?
We were contracted to perform an evaluation of the live facial recognition, or the facial recognition algorithm which is being used in live facial recognition, and also in the other applications that Lindsey mentioned. And the scope of the study was to look at performance in terms of accuracy, and performance in terms of the differences in accuracy for different demographics, by different demographics. And in doing that, we were running an evaluation using a set of test subjects, recruited test subjects, recruited specifically for the evaluation, in addition to data which was provided by Met Police to provide a large reference data set, or a large watch list. I hesitate to call it a watch list because it's far larger than would normally be on a watch list, but a large amount of data that allowed us to look at the differences in performance on a demographic by demographic basis. Our findings on the the performance and on the demographics. Taking the findings on performance, we found that the system to be very accurate in some of the applications. The retrospective face recognition and the officer-initiated face recognition, the system was delivering, if you like, perfect performance. It was getting 100% accuracy. So for those applications, when the errors, there are no errors for any part of any demographic, that's not showing any bias at all. For the live facial recognition, which is a slightly harder task for facial recognition, there was non-detection rate. So it was about 90% of people were being recognised, and it was fairly constant across the different demographics. We did observe a difference in performance between some of the demographics, but the observations which we had in terms of the recognition rate were not. I'm going to talk a bit statistically. They're not inconsistent with the hypothesis that there was no difference at all in performance. So if you're running an experiment and there is a certain chance of being falsely identified or falsely not identified, you could have a null hypothesis to say there is no difference between demographic, and the results which we had, the observations we had, were not inconsistent with the hypothesis that there was no difference. Having said that, we did observe that there was some difference. I think that as I recall, the Asian females were the best performing, had the best recognition rate, and the black females of the demographics had the lowest. But the values were really quite close. So we can't. I mean, you can kind of never show that there is no bias, because inevitably,
There is bias.
when you run a test, if you're tossing coins, so to say, are these fair coins, you'll always find that if you toss a coin a lot of times, it's not going to show. If it's 1,000 times, it's not going to be 500 heads and 500 tails for a bias coin. So there's always going to be a small amount of
Graham, any?
So when we looked at that, we in terms of the other type of error rate, so this is people being falsely identified, we observe that at threshold setting, so that the face recognition systems have a controllable parameter, and as you change that controllable parameter, it makes it the amount of evidence that it is the same face. It requires more evidence. It requires, if you like, a higher comparison score, and if that's changed in one direction, that will mean that the detection rate will decrease, and the true detection rate will decrease, and the false detection rate will both decrease. Or the other way, you could have it set so that it's more accepting of comparison, so that the true detection rate will increase, but also the false detection rate will increase.
Dr. Mansfield, we'll have to be brief because we've got a lot of questions to go through. Just finally on that, and then I'll turn back to Graham.
So we find that if the system is run at low thresholds and easy thresholds, that the system does start showing a bias against the black males and females combined, sort of thing. So there is some evidence if the system is operated at certain thresholds, which I believe are outside those that the Met Police have been deploying.
If you could give a very brief answer to this, is there scope for improving the system?
As a scientist who believes in improvement in technology, there is scope for improving systems, yes.
Thank you.
The risk of prolonging. What kind of improvements? What are the nature of the improvements that you would see?
Everything. Well, a lot of things are a trade-off. So you could have a more expensive system with better cameras, that will be able to make better decisions. The suppliers of face recognition technology, every time that there's an iteration, that tends to give an improvement in performance. We have with technology that in some circumstances already can give no errors, which is good sort of thing. And then this is looking at the technology on its own. There are also mitigations which might be put in place so that we evaluated the algorithm on its own, but the algorithm actually does operate in conjunction with an operator or a police officer that's also got the information of the other images. So there are scope for avoiding incorrect recognitions at a human level as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Graham. Rebecca Long-Bailey and then Erin Bell.
Thank you. Lindsey, you mentioned earlier some of the oversight bodies that govern the use of biometrics and facial recognition and some of the regulation and guidance that governs the area. Now, I'm sure you'll be aware that there's a piece of legislation working its way through Parliament at the moment called the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, and it proposes to abolish the Office of Commissioner for the Retention and Use of Biometrics. It proposes to repeal both the duty on the government to publish a surveillance camera code of practice governing the use of public space surveillance systems by police and local authorities, and also the requirement for a surveillance camera commissioner to oversee it. Now, that was so concerning that the Biometrics Commissioner himself wrote to the committee stating that it's worth noting that police accountability in their use of new technology such as facial recognition, voice pattern analysis and other AI-driven capabilities is one of the most contentious aspects of biometric surveillance, yet remains unaddressed either in the bill, the focus of which remains solely the regulation of DNA and fingerprints in certain limited circumstances, or at all. Are you concerned?
Taking a step back, what I'm concerned about is this technology is really innovative, new, and quite difficult to get our heads around for all of us, I think, as is AI as we move forwards. The technology is cross-cutting when it comes to regulators, so it cuts across the Biometrics Commissioner, now combines, as you know, with the Surveillance Camera Commissioner. It cuts across the ICO, it cuts across EHRC, it cuts across so many different places. I don't think that necessarily more surveillance added on and built up, more oversight added on and built up is the best oversight. We run the risk of having siloed oversight, so oversight for surveillance, oversight for biometrics, oversight from data, when actually it cuts across all of that. And currently there is guidance out there which also sort of crosses over and overlaps a little bit. So rather than building additional layer upon layer of oversight at a more superficial level, for me, I think when it comes to oversight, it would be great to have simplified oversight, but with the right questions, and that's the key, isn't it? The right deep dive into how we're using that technology to make sure that we're behaving in the way we should and the way we commit to in our policy. As a policing organisation, there's also other oversight like HMIC to bring into it as well.
Do you have concerns about the capability that will be available once these offices have been abolished and surveillance monitoring is essentially centralised, for want of a better phrase?
My understanding, and I'm not an expert on this bill at all from a policing point of view, my understanding is that the role of the Surveillance Camera Commission will be absorbed into the Information Commissioner's office, which from my point of view, less different bodies of surveillance and a more simplistic approach to get to the point of asking the right questions is probably helpful.
And on a separate issue, we were discussing the number of images that were held on the Police National Database. Have you got a figure as to how many images are currently on the Police National Database?
I don't, I'm afraid. I would have to write to you with
Maybe
that
to come back to
afterwards.
us with that figure. That would be
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
helpful.
Just to be clear, though, when we're using live facial recognition technology, the numbers on our watch list are around in and around sort of 9,000. I think we had just over 10,000 for the coronation of a reasoned understanding as to why those crime types or individuals are on that watch list. For the experiment, for the work that Dr. Mansfield was talking about, the watch lists or groups were deliberately increased to allow that to happen. And then when you look at PND, it's vast, it's much, much higher numbers.
And then final question, on the ground, in terms of the use of this technology, how are police officers and police personnel trained to deploy this?
So recognising the concerns we've talked about today, prior to every deployment, the police officers who are going to be involved in the use of the technology have a bespoke training session. And that bespoke training session is led by one of my officers who's an expert in facial recognition technology, and they run through the kit and how it works. They run through police powers and remind them of the need to make their own decisions at the point of getting that match that we talked about. And we run through the things to watch out for. So we run through things like demographic differentials. We run through how age might affect things. We run through how if a trans person was to walk past, the necessity for privacy around that and some of the things they need to be thinking about on the ground. We run through bias. We talk about it. We talk about the findings of Dr. Mansfield's report.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Aaron Bell and then Tracy Crouch.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Chiswick, just going back to what you said earlier about proportionality and all of the guidance and the various criteria you operate under. I mean, surely there might be instances where the model of linking up all the cameras would be proportionate. If there was a very dangerous escaped criminal or someone who just committed a serious crime, would the Met or perhaps other agencies be able to use facial recognition technology on a grand scale across the whole capital or indeed across the whole country if we were looking for one individual and it was a proportionate thing to do?
It's a really difficult question in terms of the proportionality of linking up all cameras to find one person. I think you'd need to also weigh into that the likelihood of actually finding that one person by joining up all the cameras. So it comes back to what's the purpose of what we're trying to achieve and what's the necessity and proportionality of that. And every time that has to be the starting point and then you make your decision. As I said earlier, technically, yes, that's possible.
Is that not what we do already with number plate recognition? I mean, are they not linked across the whole country if we're looking for a particular car?
I guess the difference is we're talking now about a biometric,
Yes.
which brings with it additional sensitivities.
If I could also move on to other uses of AI, because we've spoken a lot about facial recognition, you've been very forthcoming in your answers, but what other uses of AI are there in the Met, talking about things like handling large volumes of data, perhaps from mobile phones, looking at social media, and what's referred to as predictive policing, such as crime mapping and individual risk assessment. Does the AI use any? Does the Met use any AI tools in any of these areas?
The Met's at the start of experimenting with some of this. So we are using automation in a number of areas. So robotic processing, essentially, which is logic-based work only. So if X, do Y, and if there's any anomalies that crop out of that, then an individual person will look at it. A number of years ago, we did some AI testing around crime pattern analysis. We learned a lot from it. We didn't then go ahead with it, and we're now looking at how we can incorporate that learning and new technology, because things have moved on quite a lot, potentially to do some more trials in the future. And of course, we're aware of large language model advances, ChatGPT, for example. There's clearly a lot of potential there, as long as it's approached in the right, careful and proportionate way. At the moment, we're not using on a day-to-day basis that kind of tooling in our work. I think there is real opportunity for policing, for handling large amounts of data, first and foremost, actually. So, yes, looking to the future, there's lots of opportunity around AI. I think what we're doing at the moment is largely around robotic processing to save time.
So there's not an algorithmic process yet that you're implying, because I think Durham Constabulary did try to create something like this and had decided to stop using it because of concerns about the ethics of it. Is that something the Met looked into, and have they come to the same conclusions that Durham Constabulary did about the ethical risks of doing this?
I can't comment on where Durham Constabulary
Yes.
got to beyond knowing that they did some experimentation in that area. I think it is something the Met are interested in. If we were to go forward with that, it would involve discussions with the various ethicists and ethics panels. So for facial recognition, we spent quite a lot of time with the London Policing Ethics Panel. They came up with 5 conditions, 5 recommendations for the ethical deployment of that technology, and we've committed to follow those 5 conditions, those 5 recommendations in all of our deployments. So if we were to go forward with another tool like that, I imagine a similar level of engagement, both with communities and with the ethics panel.
And if you did go down this route at all, there's obviously a real question about bias potentially being introduced by the data set you choose. Do you think it could be a tool that could reduce bias because you take out some of the human bias that I'm sure some of your officers have, whether intentional or unintentional? Or do you think, as per what Ms. Butler said earlier, that it could actually exacerbate bias if it's being trained on historic data that has all that human bias in it?
Yes, it could. I think you're right, and it will be one of the things we'd need to pay really close attention to. In terms of your point about actually removing the human bias, that's something I would say potentially you could demonstrate with facial recognition technology. So rather than an officer standing, say, at Waterloo Station, trying to remember the briefing they got of the 10 photos at lineup, and then trying to look across and see who might be a match and using their instinct, actually, in a way, the precise crime fighting of the facial recognition technology removes that. So, you know, you can flip the argument.
Thank you.
Lindsey, you were talking about deployment earlier. We've seen an increase, unfortunately, in football-related disorder. Is this something that's being used at football matches, other sporting events?
The Met hasn't used it in that way yet. It's something we'll certainly keep under review, and I can see the potential for its use around football banning orders, for example.
And am I right in thinking, though, that South Wales Police may have used it recently at a rugby match?
The most recent deployment of South Wales Police, I understand, was at a concert recently where there was intelligence to suggest there was going to be criminality related to that.
If it were to be used, particularly in football,
Yep.
where I could see that there may well be, use for it, who pays for it? Would it come out of the national policing, football policing budget, or would it come out of the sports bodies? I mean, who ends up paying for the technology to be used?
I don't know the answer to that. The technology itself is paid for, so that doesn't cost. It would be the cost of the policing operation on the ground, and the use of live facial recognition would only form a very small slice, a very small part of that wider policing operation. So how the policing operation is usually paid for is the live facial recognition technology will be a part of that.
2 questions to you just on the national league work, obviously. Staying with the theme of football, do you have conversations with individual clubs about the technology and how it could be used by them?
Not yet, but there's clearly a lot of potential both around football, transport hubs, airports. I mean, the list of potential places for the informed and careful use of the technology is vast, and yes, that is another option. And then that opens up opportunities, doesn't it, around potentially it being owned and run by football clubs themselves. Indeed, if you look in the private sector at the moment, a number of shops are using it already. So, yeah.
A second question as national lead. My brief mentions a tool that's being used by Kent Police, the evidence-based investigation tool, which it says is an algorithm which produces a probability score of a crime's solvability, which informs decision-making around resourcing cases. Now, I understand what all those words mean on an individual basis, but could you explain what it means in practical terms?
No, I'm afraid I can't. I'm the national lead for facial recognition. I'm afraid AI and tools such as that sits elsewhere, so you would really have to speak to someone from Kent Police. I don't know that tool.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mansfield, very quickly, you actually answered my questions around the main findings of your recently published research. But I'm interested in what further research in this area is needed. You talked about improvements, but I wonder if there's any specific research that you would like to do.
there's potential for research exactly on face recognition, and maybe it may be delivering improvements to the existing capabilities. But of course, NPL, our interests are much broader than just face recognition. So we are working on other areas of artificial intelligence, and we are involved in the AI Standards Hub that's led by Alan Turing Institute and involves BSI, ourselves, National Physical Laboratory, and the Office for Artificial Intelligence. So there are things which are going on in terms of developing, if you like, capabilities for or being able to evaluate, to certify maybe artificial intelligence solutions in a wide variety of areas.
Do you know what an evidence-based investigation tool is?
I would say no. Like you say, you can look at the words and you can assume what it might mean. So there may be something there that say, okay, this is, from the sounds of it, it's sort of saying, okay, is there a possibility of us working out which crimes are more solvable than others or more amenable? But I'm not totally sure what that in itself means, and I would have difficulty if I was saying, if someone said, okay, we've got such a system, can NPL evaluate it? Because unless I know what it is trying to do, I cannot devise a test process.
Thank you very much indeed. So we'll come to Carol Monaghan, and then Dawn Butler has another question, and then Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Chair. Lindsey, can I start with you? You talked a little while ago about how advanced the technology was, and it was difficult to keep up with the advances. I think we all understand that we're not likely as mere mortals to understand how the technology works, but we do understand the implications of using the technology, and I think that's really what we're trying to get our heads around this morning. You talked about not wanting more oversight, and you talked about adding on layer upon layer of oversight. I want to ask you a little bit about legislation because, as my colleague Rebecca Long-Bailey has already said, we have a bill passing through this place at the moment, which is looking to remove the surveillance camera commissioner. And you talked about the duplication of different bodies. Now, it's my understanding that the Information Commissioner's Office has a code of practice for CCTV, but that is an advisory code of practice rather than a code of practice that is an oversight, and that's quite a difference. Where does that leave you if you now have oversight by something that is potentially advisory as opposed to a body that is looking in great detail at what you're doing with people's data and how you're using it?
So at the moment, I sort of weave into our policy the advice from both the Information Commissioner's Office and the Surveillance Camera Commissioner and the Biometrics Commissioner and the other bodies. And the other thing that I haven't mentioned yet that we now have in place for the deployment of live facial recognition is authorised professional practice through the College of Policing, which was quite a big step forward when that came in. I don't see it as making a huge difference to me. I'm not going to suddenly change how we're operating as new advice and guidance and policy comes in regularly, and we'll always review it and ensure we've adopted where we can what that guidance is pointing to. And it's not so much a case of not wanting oversight or not wanting more oversight. What I really want is the right sort of oversight to really get to the right questions, the searching questions, which will give you the assurance.
And do you think an advisory code is going to give that scrutiny and those searching questions?
The code is one thing. The then follow-up and oversight and questions that are asked of the Met of how they're applying it is another thing. And I think both of those things need to come together.
Does the ICO do that just now?
Throughout the deployment of facial recognition, we've actually worked very closely with the ICO and been on the receiving end of some very helpful guidance as we've been going forward.
You keep talking about guidance and advice. That's different from scrutiny. So I'm trying to establish whether, if the ICO takes on that role that is carried out just now by the Surveillance Camera Commissioner, is there going to be the same level of scrutiny? Working closely can mean guidance and advice. It doesn't necessarily mean an oversight of what's going on and scrutinising the practices.
I don't think I can really answer that. I think that's a question for the ICO as to how they will change in the light of if that bill goes forward and those recommendations.
They don't carry out that role at the moment.
They carry out that role in relation to data and our data protection impact assessment and how we handle data in relation to facial recognition. The role of the Surveillance Camera Commissioner is to look at how we address his code of practice. And this is where it gets confusing, isn't it? Where there's overlap. And you can see now the confusion is there. So in my mind, if the bill goes through and those changes are made, we'll also see a shift in how the ICO operate to incorporate those additional measures. That's how I see it. I don't know if that will happen. Again, it's a question for the Home Office and for the ICO.
Dr Mansfield, is there anything you're aware of that, I know legislation is maybe not your strength, are there things when you carried out your investigation and produced the report that you felt was slightly grey in terms of legislation?
Not so much in terms of the exact system we were evaluating, but I'm involved in international standards for biometrics, particularly those looking at evaluation of performance. And in our committees, we do have a piece of work which is addressing the need to be able to, if you like, audit biometric systems that are used for surveillance. And part of that is because of European legislation and the European desire, in European legislation, the use of face recognition for surveillance is a high-risk application, and that requires kind of stricter levels of governance. And what will be necessary is to have more than just, if you like, a performance assessment, but also to look in perhaps in more detail about how systems have been developed and things like that. So there is work which is going on that I'm aware of in terms of, if you like, bringing the scientists and the evaluation community in biometrics, so that there's more that can be addressed in terms of surveillance systems. So, for example, the evaluation which we did for Lindsey and the Met Police, we were just evaluating the algorithms. We were evaluating the algorithms as a black box. So we don't make any assumptions about the models inside, and we just assess it empirically by having volunteers going through the system. We know what recognition should be made and what recognition should not be made, what matches should not be made, because we know the ground truth as to the identities. But what we don't have is an audit of the processes in terms of developing the AI that's being used. We don't see what problems they've been trying to address. We don't know what data sets they've used, if they've been using other face data sets. And in other areas, at MPL, in other areas where we're working in AI, we know that there can be issues in terms of whether the training data set is sufficiently adequate, whether it comes from multiple sources or not, whether it is accurately ground truth. So there are a number of issues like that that would be applicable to governance of AI systems and AI systems using face recognition.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. I think Dawn had a brief further question, and then Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. Lindsey, sorry, in response to Tracy, you said that you've never deployed LFR at a football match. How do you decide where you deploy LFR?
So it's based on an intelligence case. So if there's... And it's based on an intelligence case and it's part of a wider policing operation. So, for example, and I've talked a little bit about Camden, which was the last sort of set of deployments we did, there was high levels of violent robbery. There was, and still is, a sort of ongoing gang issues in the area. There was the shooting at Euston at the church, some of you remember, in January this year. And that and a number of other issues pointed towards it being a good location as part of a wider policing operation going on at the time to deploy facial recognition in that area. So there is a requirement to do so. The other thing I didn't mention was violence against women and girls. There's a nighttime economy there, and there's some issues around violence against women and girls related to that nighttime economy. So
none of that applies to football?
No, it doesn't. And it was different for the coronation. And the use case, the requirement there, the primary requirement was to protect public safety. So if fixated individuals, if there was intelligence that fixated individuals were going to be at the coronation and we had their image, that was a good use case for that. Now, if we're already deploying the technology for that reason, and we have other people wanted on court warrants or wanted for other offences, who those intelligence suggest are going to be in the sort of broad area at the time, we can put those on the watch list as well. That came up in the Bridges judgment and appeal, and that's what
violence against women and girls increases after football matches, during football matches. Yeah. So I am surprised that it's never been deployed at a football match. How many times has it been deployed at Notting Hill Carnival?
Once.
Okay.
Once, and that was in the very early days of us learning to use the technology, and it wasn't a very successful deployment, and what we learned from that was the sheer number of faces, the density of the crowd made it very difficult for the technology to operate. There was just too many, it was too packed, there were too many faces, so we'll take that learning and use it going forwards.
So how does that apply then to Wembley Way, you know, with 60,000 plus? You know, where does it get to a point where there are too many people for it to be deployed?
I mean, this comes down to recceing in advance where we're going to deploy, using previous knowledge of other events and looking at the best place for that technology to sit. I don't know Wembley, unfortunately, I don't know Wembley Way, but I'm not necessarily saying that's where we'd deploy the kit. There's a number of places in and around football where it could be deployed, and as part of the planning for that event, the recce's would be important, plus that learning that I've just talked about and other learning we pick up along the way. So after every deployment, we consider what we've learned from it, and we use that to go forward. This is early days, so absolutely right on Vorg and absolutely right on football, and it's a really interesting point that I'll take forward and think about. But this is something we're going to have to build on as we go forwards.
Okay. Can we go finally to Stephen Metcalfe?
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning. I think from your view, this is a really useful tool.
Yes.
I'm slightly puzzled why Dr. Mansfield described it as high risk when you say it's so very accurate. Can you just clarify?
I said the European Commission declared that it's high. It counts as a high risk.
Okay. But do you agree with that? Just briefly, I want to need to keep this quite tight because we have run out of time.
Not necessarily in the worst cases. I mean, you can imagine cases that, yes, I would classify it as being high risk, and in other cases I perhaps wouldn't.
But if it's accurate, how can it be high risk? If it's just an accurate tool that identifies people who are on a watch list, how is it high risk?
Bias.
It's
okay.
This is not my classification.
No. Okay. No. Fair enough. I suppose what I'm trying to get to is the system doing anything more than at a significantly larger scale than a well-trained, particularly observant, particularly experienced officer might be able to do, sitting at a good vantage point within a crowd.
An officer would never be able to do what that kit does.
At scale.
At scale. So,
But could it, I'm saying, if you had a superhuman officer, is it doing anything more than that, other than identifying people?
so no, it's not. But an officer could never remember 10,000 faces and identify them in a crowd. So,
Points, but imagine he could for a moment. It would be
no.
extraordinary, but that's all it's doing. It's not identifying people outside of a list of people who you've put on a watch list. Right.
it only takes us so
Why
far.
is not everyone on the Met Police's watch list on the watch list that you deploy when you deploy the technology?
So we have learnt a lot from the Bridges judgment and the Bridges appeal. In those two reviews, appeal and the review, there were questions asked around two deployments, around specifically the who and the where, the who related to the watch list. So our policy and the authorised professional practice, which the College of Policing now have taken their learning from what came out of Bridges, because there's not a lot out there to go on. And we need to have reason for having people on a watch list. It can't just be everybody.
But you've got to, this is back to my difference between the technology and an officer. The Met maintain a database of people they would like to
Yes.
interview, discuss,
Yes.
potential. Why are all those people not on the list when the technology is deployed? Because if an officer could remember those tens of thousands, that would be perfectly acceptable for them to go up to someone and say, I think I would like to have a word with you and discuss this further.
It comes back to necessity and proportionality. The people on that watch list for a deployment of live facial recognition technology, there needs to be some likelihood of them being in the area where those cameras are deployed at the time. So if I'm deploying cameras in Camden, now albeit it's a transport hub, there's train, there's tube, the neighbouring boroughs, there's evidence of people travelling across London to go to Camden. If there's someone from Newcastle, say, I wouldn't have them on that watch list.
No. But is that...
I understand your comments are across London, but still some thought needs to go into that watch list to look at the likelihood of people being on there actually having a chance of
But
catching
why?
them.
Because you think the accuracy of the technology would start to falter if you may had too many people on the list?
Not at all, not at all. The technology can deal with it. It's to do with...
So was this just a...
It's to do with the law and the Bridges judgment.
Right, so
proportionality.
and was that a sticking plaster?
Was what a sticking
Was
plaster.
those judgments, were those to placate those who opposed the technology, or was there a real operational reason for this? Because back to the comparison between the technology and a very well-trained, experienced supermemory officer, it's not doing anything more than identifying those who are potential suspects.
I don't think a judicial review operates in that manner as either a sticking plaster
Then why
or as something
limit
to
it?
placate people. A judicial review examines the facts at the time, which are the facts of two very specific deployments.
Okay. So it is limited in its use. It has a list that's deleted after 24 hours. Again, but you don't delete the main list, and you don't ask officers to forget who they're looking for. Why has it only been deployed in Camden and Islington across London? I think you said it's been deployed 6 times,
So
three of which...
I'm talking about this year.
Yeah, but if it's such a good tool, why is it not more readily and rapidly and
So I've talked
regularly used?
I've talked about the journey we're on at the moment.
Right.
You know, it's taken a lot of work to get us here in the right way. Now we have the findings of Dr. Mansfield's report. That's really helpful. And I think we do intend to use it more often in future in the right way with the right safeguards in place.
Would you like to change some of those judgments that have been put in place previously that restrict how this is used?
So I think a judicial review is a separate thing. I think if we look at the law and what we're allowed to operate under, currently we operate under common law with the patchwork quilt of different laws like the Human Rights Act, the Equalities Act, Data Protection Act underneath that. And then we have College of Policing authorised professional practice underneath that, which was a brilliant step forward and really helpful for police who want to use the technology. When it comes to the law and AI, I think regulating each individual technology is probably not the way forward, because the law takes a long time to make, doesn't it? And by the time the law is made and gone through, the technology will have changed and it'll be out of date. We see that a little bit with the Investigatory Powers Act, for example. So in order for law to keep pace with AI and fast-changing technology, I think broader is probably better. But yes, I can see a future where the law will need to change to keep pace with a whole range of AI opportunity out there, and I guess that's what you're here to.
Yes, and that is my final point, is about where the future lies. I suppose what I'm asking you to take a view on is, are we regulating this technology in a different way because it's got the word technology in it, rather than what it actually does, the way we regulate the way an officer may behave? And can you see that changing in the future, and would you like to see it change in the future? And can you see any other ways, or what in future would you envisage for the use of AI and this sort of facial technology?
So I think oversight is really important as part of the assurance measures for the public, along with our transparency and our engagement and everything else. So I think it's important. I think it's important to do it in the right way, with the right questions that get to the point of how we're using the tech, and then separate, actually, officer behaviour and how they go about their day-to-day policing duties. We have oversight from HMIC, we have oversight from MOPAC and from a number of other places. I separate those out in my own mind, because to bring them together would be quite difficult, wouldn't it? It gets even more confusing. So in terms of the AI, I guess what I would like is streamlined, clear advice around oversight and what's expected, asking the right questions, and not sort of taking where we are now and just building it up and up and up. It kind of needs something which is coordinated and streamlined.
Okay. Just final point. I did say that was my final point, but do you think that the technology can potentially be rolled out across an entire city? If the accuracy is as good as it says, is there any reason to restrict how widely it is used? Does it do anything more? Does it present any more of a threat than an officer does?
I don't believe it presents any more threat. I don't even like that terminology, than an officer.
Risk. I don't know what the right word is. I don't mean the officer.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So technically it's feasible. The future is going to see the use of facial recognition more and more in the private sphere. It's going to see the use of facial recognition potentially by criminals as they try and identify undercover officers, for example, and other nefarious activity. So it feels right to me that the police moves with the times, looks at technology in a careful way, and looks how we can make the best of it. But at the same time, we police by consent, and there's a big part of this which is public consent to our use of that technology. Now, we did there was some polling a number of years ago. We need to renew the polling. Polling a number of years ago by a variety of different organisations showed between, I think it was 70 and 85% of the public were supportive of the police use of live facial recognition technology, but of course that depends on the question asked, and I think there's some really interesting work that can be done around that so that we can understand and bring the public with us. Ultimately, it comes down to a privacy versus security debate, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Personally, I am relaxed about my image, my biometrics being momentarily taken, compared against a watch list, pixelated in the back of the van so that people can't see my face. And if that helps prevent crime and stops a wanted offender being on the streets, I'm fine with that. I understand not everybody's in that position. And that privacy and security debate, I can contribute to it from the police world, but it's not for me to lead it.
Finally, Catherine, one last question.
Very briefly, I think so much of the use of technology is about the application by humans of it. So I just wanted to return back to how the faces get into the system that they're being looked for and what operational oversight there is there. Because we've had some concerning incidents in the past, especially around VOG, And I'm wondering whether if somebody is looking for his ex-girlfriend and happens to be the man in the van, whether he can put that face in, or whether there is a robust framework to make sure that the faces the system is searching for is only people with a reasonable evidence base.
Yeah, okay. So as reassurance, when one of these operations is put together, there's an authorisation process. The authorisation, there's a form filled out with the intelligence case, with the watch list categories, with different levels of intrusion signed off at different levels depending on what it is. So we recognise, for example, children under 18s, people with disabilities, and we talked briefly about trans people earlier. They're examples of areas of extra sensitivity where extra thought needs to be given.
Well, I'm probably confident in that you're very robust in the official list that you're searching for. It's who is checking that, I don't know, Maureen, who's actually loading up the system to look, is only looking for what you think she's looking for.
That process I described to you is signed off by a superintendent. If additional images came in, for example, we were deploying and then suddenly there was an alert and there's a wanted offender on the street and we needed to get it quickly into the system, that would also have to go through either the superintendent, who's the authorising officer for the operation, or the gold commander who's actually overseeing that operation on that day. It may be one and the same person.
So the superintendent is in effect in charge of monitoring the fact that only the official list is being searched.
Yes.
Right, and that requires a certain level of technological capability from that individual.
The superintendent themselves won't personally be doing that uploading work. That will be undertaken by an engineer.
Yeah, and it's the engineer. Fine, it's the
and the
superintendent
has oversight and responsibility for that.
Yeah, perhaps if there's any opportunity to clarify the checking process afterwards, I'm conscious of time.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
As is evident, we have lots of questions and probably some more that actually we'd like to follow up in writing with you both, if we may. But thank you very much indeed. You've been very comprehensive and wide-ranging in your answers. Very grateful to Lindsey Chadwick and Dr. Tony Mansfield for their evidence this morning. We're now going to turn to our next panel of witnesses, a pair of witnesses. I'd like to invite to the table Michael Birtwistle, who is the Associate Director for AI and Data Law and Policy at the Ada Lovelace Institute. And joining Mr. Birtwistle at the table is Dr. Marion Oswald of the Alan Turing Institute, who is a lawyer as well as an academic, who researches the interaction between law and digital technology and human rights ethics and the use of data within policing and the intelligence agencies. And Dr. Oswald also chairs the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner and West Midlands Police Data Ethics Committee. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for coming, and thanks for being here for the previous session. You've heard some of the questions and the scrutiny that has been on our minds. Perhaps I can turn to Mr. Birtwistle first and just give the committee your assessment of, I think, the question that ran through the previous panel, which is, can algorithms and AI, in this case applied to facial recognition, be safely used in policing, would you say?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the committee for having me today. I think there are two broad classes of risks that are associated with use of biometrics in policing that we've heard today about the accuracy of those systems, the differential accuracy of those systems, and a sort of second class around the power of facial recognition systems, biometric systems, to undermine democratic rights and freedoms such as privacy. We think that without a proper regulatory framework, there isn't a guarantee that facial recognition systems deployed by police will meet reasonable standards of accuracy, or that their use will remain proportionate to the risks presented by them. In July 2019, this committee called for an independent review of the options for the use and retention of biometric data. And the Ada Lovelace Institute decided to respond to that call, and last year published a report that represented the culmination of a 3-year programme of work on biometrics governance. That included public engagement research on attitudes towards biometric technologies, both via a nationally representative survey and via a Citizens Biometrics Council, and an independent legal review by Matthew Ryder, KC. That report made some urgent recommendations about the sort of sufficient legal framework that we need to govern these technologies, both in the public and the private sector.
Okay. Can I just ask on that? We're talking about facial recognition, but there's a specific AI dimension to it. Is there a specific concern about the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning with facial recognition technologies, or are the concerns of the Ada Lovelace Institute around facial recognition, as it were, sort of without the AI dimension?
So there's sort of two parts to that question. I think our concerns, as articulated in the countermeasures report last year, centre on the use of biometric data as a uniquely personal data type, which is then, and second part, often used now in combination increasingly with artificial intelligence technologies, not only to infer identity about people, but also to identify, infer other characteristics. Now that could be a protected characteristic, but it also could be an internal state, such as whether you're paying attention, what emotion you're feeling, whether you have violent intent, and make claims about those sorts of predictions. So it's the combination of both biometric data and the applications that it is increasingly being used for.
But doesn't that combination actually supply some of the answers to the earlier concerns about facial recognition, so that we know that human beings are prone to biases. If it's a human being that is looking out for people to question and to detain, they consciously or unconsciously may be biased in the types of people that they stop and search. If you have AI that is providing the filter, that is not subject to those same human biases, does that not inject a greater rigour into the selection of images for people to be questioned?
There is a often cited ambition for that to be the eventual place that these technologies are capable of doing, but it is not the case in terms of typically the accuracy of these systems. Bias, as identified in two CDI AI barometer reports, is one of the highest risks of these systems. So in fact, the risk currently goes the other way towards entrenchment of potential discrimination by these systems. And it's also not the practice of how that is used. The police do use a human in the loop currently, and even under those circumstances, the Court of Appeal held in the Bridges judgment that the use of facial recognition was not according to the law.
What do you make of the report of the National Physical Laboratory? We've heard from Dr. Mansfield that looked at the deployment by the Metropolitan Police, some of it experimental, and concluded that there was no significant evidence of bias in terms of demographic groups.
So, while I think it's laudable for the police forces to have submitted their systems to this kind of scrutiny, firstly, there is no clear legal requirement for police forces to test or demonstrate the accuracy of facial recognition in this way. And this is a snapshot of a single version of a single system set to a very particular setting. And the results can't be generalized to other systems or versions, or variations in deployment conditions, so poor lighting or weather, video compression, lower quality watch list images, which are all covered in 9.7 of that report as areas for further research.
Okay. Let me take some questions from colleagues, starting with Erin Bell, then Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Could I turn to Dr. Oswald as well? What do you see as the main risks associated with AI in the policing and security context, and are they being mitigated, or how could they be mitigated if they're not?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I suppose it might be just worth briefly summarising what the AI that being used by the police is at the moment. I think we can probably narrow them down into three categories, or 3 or 4 categories. Firstly, tools that are really there for recording and organising data. Secondly, data analytics, so to try and create insights, trends, connections between people, using things like natural language processing and network analysis. And then, quite importantly, risk prediction, which I think is where the solvability algorithm would come in. So trying to predict future happenings or future risks based on past data, either individuals or situations. So that's what the solvability algorithm basically is. And then tools to identify people, as you've been discussing this morning. I think there is definitely some potential around these tools, and we've certainly seen some of these tools having this potential within the West Midlands Committee. But I think within policing there's actually quite limited use of these tools, and you might be surprised the number of forces still using Excel spreadsheets and not the more sophisticated methods. And I think this is down to the issue around data basics, the fact that data is not necessarily held in a consistent format. The update for the Police National Computer is delayed. It's not now to incorporate the intelligence records in the Police National Database. And so a number of bigger forces have actually invested their own time and money in separate databases. We heard from Lindsey about their investment in a different system for photographs. So all data isn't really joined up, it's not necessarily consistent, and so that in itself creates a risk. And I think we also don't have a complete picture of what forces are doing with AI and machine learning, because there's no central public record or database. So we only know from things like local knowledge, freedom of information requests, House of Lords reports, that sort of thing. In terms of the risks, there is really no consistent or agreed ethical, scientific evaluation, transparency or quality standards around the technology to decide whether it's any good for a particular policing purpose. So each police force is really left to decide whether to develop or deploy or buy technologies. And I think, as we heard in the previous session, that police forces are asking for more consistent and overarching guidance around this. We also continue to see many examples of AI, sometimes built by commercial providers, promoted for criminal justice purposes, such as AI weapons detection or detecting violent behaviour on trains, without any independent validation or checking of whether those claims are valid, and that's particularly concerning in that context.
Dr. Oswald, can we be a bit brief, please?
Yes, of course.
You've given written evidence, so we're keen to have sort of oral exchanges. So we take as read the evidence that you've submitted. Aaron.
Thank you, Chair. You set out some of those risks there then. That do you think any police forces are in a position to evaluate what these tools that they're using? Let's leave facial recognition to one side for a minute, because we've talked a lot about it already. All this other stuff actually is potentially, in my view, more concerning, because we don't know about the efficacy of it. We haven't had the sort of tests that the National Physical Laboratory have done, and basically forces are experimenting. Now, one of the advantages of having lots of forces is that you can try things out in different areas, but are they in any position to evaluate whether it's any good?
I think some forces are, because they have internal expertise to do that, or they have bodies that they can go to, independent advisors that they can get that sort of advice from. Other smaller forces may be in a much more limiting position in that respect, and so this is why there is such an importance for the national guidance, national standards to be set. And for the standards to relate to the coercive powers that the police have. The technology is not there on its own, it's related to the stop and search, the arrest, the investigatory powers that the police are deploying, and so the guidance really needs to very clearly relate to that.
And do you think all these forces are aware of the ethical risks involved, and do you think they are all aware of the need to keep, as the phrase goes, the human in the loop when they are trialing these things out?
I think there's definitely an awareness of that human in the loop concept. What that means, though, is quite difficult. I mean, in facial recognition terms, we heard about how officers are giving training about the deployment of facial recognition, but it's very difficult when you're presented with a match to decide what to do with it unless you really understand the settings of the system, what the uncertainties might be, what the risks are for errors and biases. In the report that the NPL issued, it's very significant that the figures around ethnic disparities are based around a particular face-matched setting. If you look at a setting of 0.56, you will see that the number of people falsely identified, of the 33 that were falsely identified, 22 of those were black. So at settings that are lower than the recommended settings, ethnic disparities will occur. And it's important for the police to be aware of that so that they can deploy those technologies in an appropriate manner.
Thank you. If I could just go back to you, Mr. Birtwistle, on the non-facial recognition stuff, what concerns do you have about the use of AI by police in, say, predictive policing or data analytics and so on? Are there examples where it's working well at the moment you're comfortable with, or is it, again, something that you're concerned about in the same way that you are with facial recognition technology?
So, Ada Lovelace Institute hasn't published research more broadly on policing use of technology. It's focused on biometrics. I can speak to the proposals in the AI white paper, which look to existing regulators, existing regulation to govern those technologies. So if we're thinking about whether the measures are going to be there to bring in those accuracy standards or to provide the scrutiny that we've been talking about, that the white paper doesn't add anything to that picture other than to provide existing regulators with a set of principles and to provide them with some central coordination and some other risk functions. However, the House of Lords report last year looking at this identified, I think, 30 different bodies responsible for looking at policing use of technology, and said it's very difficult to build up a complete picture, and so it's not clear how the white paper proposes to improve governance in such diffusely regulated contexts like policing.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Dr. Oswald, can you briefly outline what some police forces are doing to increase transparency around the use of AI and data, such as the committee that you chair in the West Midlands?
Yeah, thank you. The committee was set up by West Midlands Police and the West Midlands PCC in 2019 to sit alongside the data analytics work that the force has been doing. It's got its own data lab and its own employed data scientists, and it was recognised that created new risks and new challenges. So we are a voluntary body made up of independent volunteers from all sorts of different backgrounds: law, ethics, computer science, medical expert, people who have knowledge of the interests of victims. And we take a rolling approach to looking at projects from the beginning sort of idea stage to operational rollout if that happens. And our role is to give pragmatic advice to the Chief Constable and the PCC and their representatives around the deployment of technology, asking them to think about how these technologies might be deployed operationally, what consequences might occur. All the minutes and papers are transparent, and so it is possible through that process to find out a lot about the sort of projects that police are considering and the sort of data that is being used. I think another really key initiative is the government's algorithmic transparency recording standard, which has recently been rolled out, and a number of police forces have contributed to the pilot of that and demonstrated how by engaging, more information could be provided to the public around technology being used within police forces. Some research I did also demonstrated that the police think that it could be a really useful initiative to help them learn from each other, because they don't necessarily know what other forces are doing and what's been successful, what hasn't been. So by further engaging in that initiative and potentially becoming even a mandatory process, that has the potential to improve quality within policing technology.
And do you think it should be a mandatory process across all forces?
My personal view is yes. There seems to be no reason why it can't be. There are initiatives that you could put in place to protect sensitive information and protect sensitive tradecraft and ensure there's appropriate exemptions. But from the research I've done, I think it could be a really positive step.
And Michael, do you think that the efforts that have just been outlined by Dr. Oswald are sufficient to address concerns that have been raised about these tools? And if not, what more needs to be done? What would you like to see?
So I think they would complement our proposals around comprehensive biometrics governance. I think there is a question about investment to scale the sort of the safeguards and the mechanisms that Marion's described would take considerable investment to roll that out on a national scale. But I think that would be a positive thing, and I'd very much echo the endorsement of the algorithmic transparency recording standard and the desire for it as it matures to for there to be a mechanism for it to be made mandatory.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Carol Monaghan now.
Thank you, Chair. Michael, could I start with you? You've already highlighted the link between AI governance and data protection. What are your thoughts on the new data protection and digital information bill that we're dealing with at the moment?
Do you mean specifically with reference to policing or more broadly?
You could start with policing. Yeah.
So I think the DPDI bill, with respect to governance of technology by police and particularly biometrics, does make the picture worse. As we've heard, the abolition of the biometrics commissioner and the surveillance camera commissioner, which are obviously held by one individual at the moment, but the code as well, are problematic. As we've heard, the commissioners have written to the bill committee stating that not all of those functions are being transferred, in his view, to the ICO or IPCO, and that those are some very important sort of provisions around scrutiny and oversight. I think it's also notable that when we're looking at something like bridges and the way that the law currently works, the one of the grounds on which facial recognition there failed to be lawful was on this question of whether it was done in accordance with the law, which, when you sort of drill down into the legal technicalities of it, is saying, is there a sufficient legal framework there? And the surveillance camera code was a core part of that legal framework that was examined, and even with that being in place, it was seen as being an insufficient framework to be in accordance with the law. So that element seems to be being taken away, which, in our view, reduces probably the confidence with which these technologies can be used in policing, with the peace of mind that they are lawful.
We heard from a previous witness about this layer upon layer of oversight and duplication. Do you see the current system as having duplication? Do you see the bill improving this in terms of users and keepers of personal information?
I mean, I think the claim that it simplifies the regulatory landscape may be true in the sense that there will be fewer actors in it, but that doesn't mean that there will be more regulatory clarity for users of that technology. And as I've said, the removal of the surveillance camera code is one such thing. The proposal that we've made in terms of comprehensive biometrics regulation would centralise a lot of those functions within a specific regulatory function within the ICO that would have specific responsibility for a lot of the sort of the safeguards that Marion has described. So things like publishing a register of public sector use, requiring biometric technologies to meet scientifically based standards, and having a role in assessing the proportionality of those being used. And having those all happening in one place, I think, would be a simplification and provide that sort of appropriate oversight.
Thank you. Dr. Oswald, do you have anything to add to that?
I'd agree that simplification doesn't necessarily mean clarity, and certainly in the policing sector, I think we need much more clarity as to where the responsibility really lies. We've got lots of bodies with fingers in the pie, but not necessarily anyone responsible for the overall cooking of the pie. So I think that's required here.
Do you see, I mean, are we getting the right balance between protection of personal data and legitimate use of biometric information?
I think it really depends on the context, and that's why the regulatory structure needs to be very focused on how police are using data and the different ways that AI can be deployed. Sometimes it's deployed in respect of, coercive powers, stop and search, arrest, but sometimes it's being deployed in the investigation stage and the intelligence stage, which brings on all sorts of different considerations. So any regulator needs to understand that and be able to set rules around those different processes and different stages.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, did you have something else to add?
I was going to say, if I can add to that, I think adding to the points made earlier about sufficient future-proofing and flexibility of the law, the way that you achieve that is by having empowered regulatory institutions that are properly resourced, and that is a concern both with biometrics but also generally with the proposals in the white paper.
Do you think, sorry, I was going to finish, but just, do you think, I mean, we're getting rid of 2 offices and shoving it all into the ICO? Is this an attempt to save money, to make, what is it really trying to do?
I can't comment on the sort of the rationale for doing that. I think that the importance of these technologies and the benefits of these technologies could be huge, and if we want to secure them, we need public trust. We need those technologies to be trustworthy, and that is worth investing regulatory capability in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Catherine is next.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Oswald, thanks for coming. The government's got an AI white paper out at the moment, so I perhaps just want to kind of pivot to what's in that and what we do for the future. So you've highlighted in your submission the need for a context-specific nuanced approach. And I just wonder if you could perhaps define that a bit better for us and cross-reference it to the government's white paper. Does the proposals within the white paper achieve, meet what you seek to achieve?
Of course, yes. I'm definitely in favour of an approach that addresses how AI is being used in the policing sector, which is what I mean by a context-specific approach, and really bringing in the key principles of criminal justice. But I am not in favour of relying only on high-level principles and hoping that everyone will be able to interpret those and what they mean, particularly in really high-stakes environments like policing. So I think that the white paper is a good first step, but we will need to interpret those principles and find out what does transparency really mean for policing and AI? What does explainability really mean? What does a police officer need to know when they are using a facial recognition tool, for example, or what do they need to know when they're using a solvability algorithm? And those things are not necessarily the same for each tool. So I think without that, we potentially will continue to see police forces deploying and rolling out different tools in a very individualised way without that consistency of approach.
Could you give us a specific, for instance, of the next level of detail under the white paper that you'd like to see in this context?
Sure. Well, if we take, say, a tool that is perhaps trying to build connections between individuals to identify new members of an organised crime gang, for example, you might build that data based on intelligence information or things like non-crime data.
This might be them all being at the same bus stop or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or, hanging around on the same street,
yeah,
or being seen in the same vicinity, or having a link via a phone number or that type of thing. The issue with intelligence is it's not, it doesn't necessarily mean something bad or something good. It's just a piece of information that you have to interpret. If you then try and put it into a data analytics tool, what happens is it tends to become either bad or good, and the nuance of it disappears. And you could end up with quite a misleading output that says just because somebody's on this street, therefore they are bad, and they are linked with these other bad people. So it's that sort of detail that really needs to be thought about before these tools are built, so you understand the data input and what it really is, and then you build the tool appropriately so that when you get the output, you really know how to use it. You don't necessarily rely on it inappropriately.
Yeah, so if I just play that back, make sure I understand you. The white paper, the principles in the white paper are you're comfortable with. It's the practical translation of those principles into a number of fields that is the area of direct.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And I think it's that the expert knowledge that you need to do that. So it's really important here.
As someone that started my career helping people get off leather-bound ledgers in his computers, it's that classic transition of. Shall we say poo in and poo out, perhaps? Yeah. Thank you for that. Michael, if I can switch to you, again, just understanding where we are with the government's AI white paper. You're calling for a clear governance framework, so that would appear to be a more broad-reaching thing that's within the government's white paper at the moment. Will it help set the scene for such a framework? Is it actually going to deliver that framework? What's your take on the white paper?
So, to be clear, our call for biometrics governance is sort of complementary, I think, to probably what's in the white paper. The white paper looks at existing regulation. We're saying that governance does not exist for biometrics currently and won't be added by the white paper, so that needs to sort of happen separately. Looking at the white paper more broadly, I think there are a lot of advantages to the context-specific approach it sets out. I think the real tests for it are going to be around implementation. And if you'll forgive the alliteration, we've sort of got three lenses or tests that we're going to be looking at it through and talking about publicly soon. One is around coverage. So there are some domains where you don't have a domain-specific regulator like employment and recruitment. And so it's not clear who's going to be responsible for making sure use cases in that sector accord with the principles. As I've said, that's also a problem for diffusely regulated sectors. It's not just policing. Education might be another where you've got sort of different regulators looking at different bits of the system, but not necessarily overall oversight. The second sort of test is around capability, institutional capability. So do regulators have the resources and the powers that they need in order to deliver on those principles? And there are some, I think, very significant questions there about the amount of resourcing needed to appropriately govern a general purpose technology like AI. And then the third one is criticality. So will we have enough action on urgent risks? And this is where the question about general purpose AI like ChatGPT comes in, and whether we need a faster response to that ahead of the implementation window of over a year that the government set out.
Yeah, understood. Fine, but the basic principles is another thing. Is there anything missing apart from perhaps more detail on the implementation? Perhaps if either of you have looked at that paper and thought, well, I really think it should have had that in it.
Privacy isn't in it, but I think the team behind the white paper have taken the view that that is already fairly comprehensively covered by data protection law. There are sort of questions not about the sort of the high-level principles, but whether or not all of the sort of instructions to regulators that these principles represent will necessarily be deliverable by those regulators under their existing powers and remits.
Dr. Oswald?
The white paper talks a lot about focusing on use and not on the technology, which I think is fair enough up to a certain point, but I think there are certain technologies or such implementations where we do have to look at the tech itself, such as emotion AI, which comes from a very dubious scientific background, similar to the polygraph. The scientific...
We all love a bit of phrenology.
Yeah, exactly. Scientific validity, very dubious there, and the ICO said that. So at some points we do have to say, do we just not want to use these, especially in criminal justice, where, serious consequences can occur.
Right, so a low evidence-based or no evidence-based technologies, the ability to exclude potentially could be included in the future white paper.
Yes.
Yeah, understood. Thank you,
Very
Joe.
much, Catherine. Next, Stephen Metcalfe, and then finally Graham Stringer.
Thank you. Michael, if I may, just a quick question about a statement that the Ada Lovelace Institute made, which was around the use of standards to create an AI governance framework, or their importance. I just wondered if you could explain exactly what that means and where you think the benefits would be.
Sure. So I think standards are going to have a very important role in any potential regulatory regime for AI. So there's...
Could you just, before we go on, define what you mean by standards? Because I think there is always a danger everyone has a different understanding.
So I think we're referring to process standards, technical standards, the sorts of things that standard-setting bodies, such as the BSI in the UK, ISO, IEEE, those sorts of bodies set, and using those as ways of helping to govern and standardise the way in which AI is developed sort of as a process. So you sort of have horizontal and process standards, and you can also have vertical standards, which are, for example, used very commonly in medical devices regulation.
Okay, thank you. And now about how you think this will work within AI. What sort of standards would you like to introduce, or do you think would work?
So I think the white paper sets out a very helpful vision of the role of standards and also assurance techniques, which are things like audit, for example, that will help support the way that different actors in the ecosystem working with AI can help know what to do is right, and also from a regulatory perspective, regulators are able to use those potentially to help understand whether or not companies look like they are doing the right sorts of things to make sure that you get the right outcomes from AI development. I think there are sort of three interesting questions around the use of standards for AI. The firstly is who gets to participate in setting them. We are doing a lot of work in Europe at the moment around the fact that these are typically set largely by industry, and there is perhaps a degree of industry capture in who gets to set them. Secondly, there's a question about regulator maturity. Some regulators are really well equipped to use them and use them as standard. Some very much less so, but they could be a really useful tool for regulators. And lastly, there's a question of the international picture. And the US and Brussels are obviously taking a very active interest in the standards that will support the development of AI, and the UK to some extent will be competing for influence over what those standards become.
Okay. And have you actually made any suggestion about what those standards should be? Practical steps that we could log and.
I don't think we've specified standards. I think we have specified, for example, within biometrics governance, a role for that function to set those standards or to identify those standards. I mean, those standards are typically developed by those standard setting organisations, so it's not. We would want to see them. We would want to see the principles within the white paper supported by those standards. But that, I believe, is work in train within government.
Okay. And has anyone that you're aware of been as bold to make any suggestions about what standards AI should be governed against?
Yes. I mean, there's lots of active work, and the UK has sort of set up a standards hub that is working with international partners in sort of working out which are most appropriate. And I believe there is work ongoing within government to understand specifically which sets of standards can support the individual principles.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you very much, Liz. And finally, Graham Stringer.
The UK looks as though it's diverging from the EU and regulatory governance framework for AI. Is it important? I mean, should the future of the governance of AI is it better at an international global level, or is it better if each country goes its own way?
I think the Ada Lovelace Institute supports interoperability of these AI technologies. That's going to be very important for ensuring that the benefits of them are distributed equitably and that they support trade between nations. I think there's a question about which bits of it you govern at what level. So there is potentially a role at the international level to look particularly at the urgency surrounding general purpose AI systems, or foundation models as they're sometimes called, and looking at some of the emerging capabilities that those systems have, and understanding whether an international approach is going to be the most effective at mitigating those quite wide-ranging risks from very powerful systems. But I think it's also right to have a context-specific approach for our country for more detailed applications, as Marion and I have already spoken to.
If I could add, I think it's important that we take account in the criminal justice context of those applications at the EU level that have been identified at the most high risk, because that will have implications for trade and criminal justice cooperation, etc. How we deal with those ourselves, I think we need to make a decision on.
And if you could have one recommendation that the government would agree to implement on its future.
House of